one.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 130th episode of the Atlas Society Asked. My name is Jennifer Grossman. My friends call me Jag. I'm the CEO of the Atlas Society. We are the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in fun, creative ways like graphic novels and animated videos. Today, we are joined by Eric Kaufmann from London, I believe. Before we get started and before I even introduce my guest, I wanted to remind all of you who are watching us on Zoom, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or YouTube. You can use the comment section to type in your questions. You can go ahead and get started to be at the top of the queue, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Okay, Eric Kaufmann is a Canadian professor of politics at Birkbeck College, University of London, and an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He is a specialist on cultural politics, religious and national identity, and demography. Professor Kaufmann has authored and co-authored many books, including The Rise and Fall of the Anglo-American, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, and his latest book, Whiteshift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. Eric, thank you for joining us. I know it's a little bit late there and a lot going on, but we're just thrilled to have you.
That's okay. Thanks very much for having me. Glad to be here.
So I already felt a bit of kinship with you. We share a mixed heritage, Jewish father, lapsed Catholic mother, but you have a much more interesting mix of ethnicities in your background. You also grew up in different countries around the world. So I'd love to learn a little bit about your origin story and how your experience growing up may have influenced your interest in ethnic, cultural, and political demography.
Well, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, I mean, like you say, I am on the one hand, secular Jewish dad and lapsed Catholic mom, but sort of, as you say, beneath that, I mean, my mom's side, she's sort of half Costa Rican and half Chinese, and they met in Hong Kong, and she's from Macau, which is a Portuguese colony. So yeah, I grew up a lot of my early years. My dad was in Tokyo as with the Canadian embassy, and then with a Canadian firm. So I sort of spent, total of 8 years in the Far East growing up. So that kind of gives you a different outlook. And one of the things it clearly does is you don't take nation as for granted, and you're more aware of national identity. And so that's kind of the beginning really of interest in nations and national difference. So I went to an international school. Every country has its booth, so you're more aware of national difference, I think, growing up abroad. But yeah, so that was kind of maybe the sort of early origins perhaps of this interest in national identity as a topic. And then I wasn't initially going to be an academic, and by hook and by crook, I wound up at the London School of Economics and studying sociology and political science. And I sort of gravitated towards the study of nationalism, which there's an individual called Anthony Smith, he's passed away a few years ago. He was a leading theorist of nationalism. And there were a number of others like Ernest Gellner as well. So it was sort of a center for the study of this. I just kind of accidentally bumped into that. So that was fortuitous. And then, of course, I guess on the ethnic side, having a few different elements in my background, growing up in a suburb of Vancouver that was predominantly what you would call WASP or British ancestry in population, being aware of some differences there. And then also being in a city that was like some US cities undergoing rapid ethnic change, say from, overwhelmingly European to having a larger Chinese component in the population. So these are all things that might have influenced my interests. And then, I did my doctorate at LSE, looking at this confluence of migration and national identity. And then that led into my first book, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, which is really about the decline of the WASP as an ethnic group in the United States, demographically, politically, in the 20th century.
Yeah, it's interesting, and Canada is its own special case. Perhaps we'll get to explore some of those differences in terms of their approach to multiculturalism. But I see that these themes are evolving throughout your three books. And the book that you wrote in 2010, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? You discussed how, on average, some religious groups tend to have more children than their secular counterparts. How have those projections held up 12 years later? And how might the higher fertility rates of, say, Haredi Jews, the Amish, Mormons, impact the demographic and political change you explore in Whiteshift?
Yeah, very interesting. So what I would say is that book, the Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, was a little bit of a departure in the sense that I was looking more at religious differences within ethnic groups. So as you see, ultra-Orthodox Jews versus secular Jews, conservative Protestants versus lapsed or liberal Protestants. That's sort of the kind of difference I was looking at. So it was a little bit moving away from the ethnic politics. But what you see is, yeah, substantial fertility rate differences. And if anything, I think those have widened and not declined since I wrote. And so, yeah, you've just seen, well, I mean, a good example would be the Jewish population of the UK and US. Which is projected to become majority ultra-Orthodox in the second half of our century. That's an example of the process I talk about, which is really through higher differential birth rates. Religious demography really is powering this change. And there have been examples of that in the past as well. If you look at evangelical Protestants in the United States, there's a good paper by Michael Houghton and Andrew Greeley and Melissa Weil, which really shows that 3/4 of the growth of conservative Protestantism in the US in the 20th century was demographic through higher birth rates. And that was one of the reasons you had this shift from about 1 in 3 Protestants being conservative to 2 in 3 in the course of the 20th century. So yeah, those are just some examples. And I don't see any change in that, incidentally. I mean, if you look at developed countries in the West today, the difference between those who are regular religious attenders and those who are sort of non-religious or religious nuns is sort of on the scale of about a half child, or in some cases a full child. Taken over generations, that'll have quite a substantial effect.
I think you talked about it as kind of time capsule whiteness. Is that correct?
Well, so there's the religious side of things. So you have this, what this leads to is a big expansion in religiously conservative populations. Then the question is, how does that affect the ethnic picture? Because what we have going on in terms of ethnicity is clearly a decline in white majorities across the West, whether in the US, whether in Europe. So you have this declining white majorities, but then a lot of these, what I call endogenous growth religious sects, these very fundamentalist, world-denying sects like the Amish, like the ultra-Orthodox Jews, they're almost entirely of European origin. And so these are the groups that are very much defying this shift to below replacement fertility rates. And so if you run projections ahead, as if nothing changes, then these groups are going to be a very large chunk of the population. That's going ahead 2 centuries, right? So that's assuming things change. But in Israel or in the Jewish world, it's going to happen a lot quicker. So it could be, as I mentioned, the UK and American Jewish diaspora is projected to go majority ultra-Orthodox in the second half of the century. That's really only 50 years, well, 30 to 50 years away. It'll take a little longer for that to happen to Christianity, but if you really look at the projections, if things continue as they are, there could be 300 million Amish in the US in the 2200s. Now, of course, that assumes a lot, but their birth rates, the birth rates of these groups, do not decline as they get wealthier or as the society gets better educated. The ultra-Orthodox in Israel have maintained, in a modern society with modern contraception and health and education, birth rates 6.5 to 7 children per woman on average.
All right, now I'd really like to dive into Whiteshift Population, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. I'm actually on my second reading, as there is
good for you.
There's a lot to absorb. And I also, though, found the way that you approach your subject to be refreshing, in that it's both deeply researched, but also kind of open-minded and even-handed as you unpack issues that are often avoided because of stigma and political correctness. So first, what is Whiteshift, and how can a better understanding of both the demographic changes underway and majority reaction to them help lower the temperature on political polarization and contribute to a more informed public policy debate?
Well, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, I mean, the basic meaning of Whiteshift, the Whiteshift 1.0, if you like, is what's happening in our century, which is the decline of white majority groups in Europe and North America and Australasia. And so just in terms of the trajectory, you're probably familiar with the US trajectory, which is something like 50% of the population being non-Hispanic white around 2050. The number jumps around, etc. Something very similar is happening in, say, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are also going to be kind of quote unquote majority minority sometime around mid-century, maybe slightly later for Australia. In Europe, it'll happen towards the end of the century. So that's really quite substantial, given that, particularly when we think of Western Europe, I mean, immigrant populations in most West European countries, 1 to 2% of the total in 1900. And, you know, that it's extremely small. So this is something quite new. And even though there have been small migrations to Western European countries, generally speaking, the scale is much, much higher. I mean, as an example, the Jews who came to Britain in the turn of the 20th century, I think at the peak, we're going at about 10 to 15,000 per year. Whereas the immigration levels, net migration levels in Britain have been above 250,000 since 1997. And this year, it hit 500,000. So, I mean, the scale is of a completely different order of magnitude. Now, that's sort of really the change which is reconfiguring our politics, because battles over the rate of this ethnic change, as symbolized by the issue of immigration, are central to understanding the rise of right-wing populism across the West, whether that's Brexit, whether that's Trump, whether that's Le Pen, whether that's the Sweden Democrats. This immigration is at the heart of this. And in the book, I really look at large-scale survey data where you can generalize. And what you can do is look at who votes, say, for the Sweden Democrats versus other parties. And there was a survey that showed, 99% of Sweden Democrat voters say immigration should be reduced. 100% of Alternative for Germany voters in the I think it was 2018 Bavarian election, might have that date wrong, agreed with the statement, Germany is gradually losing its culture. So this sort of cultural psychological underpinning to immigration opinion, which in turn is underpinning the populist vote, is absolutely vital for understanding what's happening. And in that context, what occurs is, instead of talking just about left-right economics, welfare state versus low tax, that conversation was very much a later 20th century conversation. We've seen a sort of reconfiguration from that economic axis to a cultural axis, which we might call globalist nationalist. Some have said open, closed, some have, that liberal, conservative, cultural dimension, which cuts across the old economic dimension. So what you find is a lot of, in fact, slightly left of center economically, working class voters voting for national populist parties of the right because they're attracted to their cultural message.
It's tricky because, for those of us who want to make the case for less government and for lower taxes and for more capitalism, this whole shift has taken the conversation to another place. And I think until we really understand what's going on and find a way to address it, we're at a loss. Like, do we just kind of make the case and try to lump in with these people, or so it's interesting. And I think that there is sort of this sense of kind of an adversarial dynamic going on as well. In Whiteshift, you observed that, quote, the progressive storyline for white majorities is a morality tale celebrating their demise, end quote. And you argue that much of today's populist reaction stems directly or indirectly from this, repulsion at this kind of celebration. So unpack that dynamic for us, if you would.
Well, so basically the book is about the intersection of ethnic and national identity, but particularly what I'm focusing on are ethnic majorities who have not received as much attention from a lot of academics. And so ethnic majorities, how they're affected by migration and demographic shifts. But then the third element is ideology and the role of the cultural left in all this, because cultural left ideology has evolved over time, but it's been a very powerful force, particularly since the mid-1960s. And so what you saw is the left becoming a little less concerned with, for example, the proletariat and the working class, and becoming more concerned with identity groups, chiefly around race, but also gender and sexuality. The concerns around race, which are emerging in the sort of late 60s, start to lead to a situation where discussions of immigration are beginning to be painted as racist and illegitimate, and therefore talking about restriction is something you don't do in polite society. And that narrowing of democratic debate, of the Overton window of what you're allowed to debate in a democratic society, then means these topics are not being debated by mainstream parties, because mainstream politicians, they want to be respected by or respectable in polite society, in the media, and so on. Now, what that actually does, however, is a bit like in the Soviet Union, where you can only make one color pair of pants. Well, a black marketeer is going to pop up to supply the blue jeans and the other things people want. And so similarly, in this case, if the main parties aren't talking about immigration levels, then a black marketeer politician, i.e. a populist, is going to pop up to provide that. And it may be somebody, like a Trump in the US or Sweden Democrats in Sweden, in 2013, when they were getting beginning to get larger influxes from other parts of the world. The interior minister in the moderate conservative government said, well, we should probably have a discussion about immigration levels in Sweden, and he was sort of shouted down as a racist in the papers. And then the next year, the Sweden Democrats, the populist party, kind of came in, burst onto the scene with 12.5%. And in just most recent election, they were on 20% and are looking like they're going to be in the governing coalition. That's an example of what I'm talking about, is where the mainstream really didn't feel comfortable addressing an issue a lot of voters wanted to address. Then that creates a vacuum that the populists will fill. And so the rise of populism, it would be very hard to imagine that if the mainstream parties were on top of this issue and having a debate that said, okay, well, we hear the voices of people who want slower ethnic change, people who want faster change, we're going to somehow meet in the middle. But that debate doesn't happen because of all of the taboos that surround this subject. So yeah, and that's one of the reasons I say that political correctness is in some ways a force that creates populism, because populism is popping into this vacuum created by these speech restrictions.
So sticking with the ideology for a second, where did this progressive storyline, not just a sort of obsession with minority identities, but a kind of denigration of white identity? You talk about the origins in terms of left modernism. We've talked about it in terms of postmodernism, with leftists adapting the conflict dynamics of Marxism after, Marxist economics was discredited, and adapting that to identity politics. Are we talking about the same thing? Is it just a difference of definitions and terms?
Yeah, really good question. I think there's an overlap, right? So I think you can actually, I do in the book, I take it back to the World War I period and the first kind of bohemian intellectuals who were modernist. Left modernism is, in my view, a distinct ideology from socialism, because left modernism combines two elements, one of which is a sort of identity-based or cultural leftism, which had a different feel to it prior to the 1960s, but it was there, but in a different way. And then this modernism, which is this strong anti-traditionalist pursuit of the new and different. And so what you saw amongst this group of bohemian intellectuals known as the young intellectuals, they were very much iconoclastic. One of their beliefs was that the WASP group, of which they were more or less all members. So Randolph Bourne is an example. He's a key figure. He's of a New England Yankee background, like many of these intellectuals. But he says, well, our group is kind of boring. They don't create anything interesting. They just want to ban alcohol and dance, and they're very not a particularly interesting, quite a parochial group. So this is a sort of first example of somebody denigrating their own group in a way. And then that takes hold in the 1920s once you have, Protestant initiated legislation like the prohibition of alcohol and the 1924 immigration restrictions that come in. And there was a real attack on white Protestant America by these generally white Protestant origin intellectuals. That's kind of the origin, but it had a different feel in the sense that their main line of attack was this group is sort of boring and they have no culture and they're not very interesting. Now, if you fast forward, that was sort of the paradigm through the 20s and arguably even through the beats in the 50s. And it's not till we get to the mid-1960s with Black Power radicalism that the feel of it becomes much more recognizable. So you already had an anti-WASP paradigm, but then in the mid-60s, you get someone like Susan Sontag sort of saying, oh, white people are a cancer on the planet, and the US is a racist society to its core. This kind of radical stuff that you didn't find back with the young intellectuals. So this time it has a much more leftist edge. It's about oppressors and oppressed. It has much more of that language. So I think we have a changing of that culture of majority repudiation to be much more aggressive, borrowing very much from both the Black Power radicalism and the European anti-colonial, because don't forget the European empires were decolonizing at this time, and this third world socialism was less Marxist and more kind of about the third world lumpen proletariat versus the West. That was the paradigm. All of that was the Western left imbibed that. So Frantz Fanon's book, 1961, The Wretched of the Earth, which is sort of this third worldist socialism, the foreword was written by Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a Western leftist. And so you get that cross-fertilization. So yeah, and then since the mid-60s, then you just have had a ratcheting up, the scaling up of all this. So when Michael Moore or people like that, or Sarah Jeong is taking a shot at white people, that's now in a tradition that goes back to the sort of mid to late 60s. But it's just that there are more of these people around because more of them have been produced in the graduate schools, and you've got social media. And for all these reasons, we're just hearing more and more of this anti-white rhetoric. Critical race theory, of course, which generates a lot of this as well, has migrated off campus into the media and into the schools, which is somewhat of a more recent development. But what I would say is these ideas have been circulating for some time. And they also impinge, of course, on the immigration discussion. Now that for the Democratic Party to deport illegal immigrants is much more difficult than under even Obama, because this ideology has really percolated really right into the party.
So returning to populism, and of course, historically, there has been left-wing populism, resentment of financial elites and belief in the muscular, classes, proletariat. Why today are right-wing populists doing better than left-wing populists?
Yeah, so we are seeing some left-wing populism. You can think about Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, Sanders in the US, or Syriza in Greece. But in general, the right populism is doing a lot better. Why is that? I think because a lot of the issues, the left populism thrives on economic issues for the most part. The right populism is largely an immigration and ethnic change driven phenomenon, and that is just much more present, I suppose, because of the pace and scale of demographic change is just a lot more advanced now. And so that simply gives a plausibility and lens, I think, has created more fertile soil for the rise of the populist right. It's also worth saying, by the way, that, I mean, the populist left has some force, but perhaps some of the raw deprivation isn't perhaps as acute now as it might have been in earlier decades.
One of the issues that we focus on a lot here at the Atlas Society is envy. And I don't know if you're familiar with the German sociologist Rainer Seidelmann. I interviewed him recently about his book, The Rich in Public Opinion, which looked at levels of envy in different countries, assigning a social envy coefficient, even looking at levels of envy within different generations in those countries. So traditionally, populism is thought of, as I mentioned, an antipathy against elites, including economic elites. But from my reading of your book, it doesn't seem like envy or an obsession about income inequality is a major driver of the new right-wing populism. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you look at the data, people who have high incomes, low incomes, there's no real difference in terms of the likelihood of them voting for populists. Economic factors, whether you've lost a job, that's not a major driver. And likewise, in the economic structure of a particular country, whether it's a relatively unequal country, like the United States, let's say, compared to a country with a very strong welfare state and more equality like Sweden, that too is not a major predictor of whether somebody is going to vote populist. We've seen populist movements in the north of Europe, which has the strong welfare state, in the south of Europe, where it's not as strong, and in the United States. So yeah, I think the evidence is overwhelmingly that this is not about economic resentment or envy, and to the extent that that exists, that's going to be more of a left populist issue. This is mainly about these cultural issues, about cultural change being too rapid for people, the sense that they're losing the country they've known. One of the best questions for picking out sympathy towards right-wing populism is to ask, well, things were better, things in America were better in the past, but especially American culture was better in the past. That kind of a question is much better than anything economic in isolating who will support these parties.
To give us a context for current concerns about immigration, is there a point in modern history where the numbers sharply increased? And if so, why is that?
Well, we're seeing, significant population movements, north-south migration in the world right now, compared to 1970. It's been, I think, sort of a doubling of the share of people who were born in the global south living in the global north. Even though migration around the world, the share of people who were born in another country around the world hasn't changed that much, actually. So yeah, we are definitely seeing an increase in migration numbers. And of course, the kind of, especially from non-traditional sources. So, up until the 1970s, immigration to North America was predominantly from Europe, and now it is overwhelmingly to the tune of 80% from outside of Europe. So there's just a longer cultural distance there, and that certainly plays into this because it's part of the population that sees difference as disorderly, change as loss. And that's very psychological, and it's significantly heritable. Actually, this is not necessarily something that people can be taught out of. And Karen Stenner, in her book, The Authoritarian Dynamic, makes this point that because of the heritability of these dispositions, there's a certain part of the population that simply responds negatively to these kinds of developments. Now, it could be other kinds of diversity, could be ideological diversity, but there is people are wired. So to give you an example, you can even have people look at dots on a screen. If you prefer dots that don't have a regular pattern versus those that are more ordered, if your desk is messy versus tidy, if you like dress codes in tennis tournaments or not, all of that actually is connected to views on immigration. And so it's kind of very interesting, but these are not things, and as Stenner points out, thinking that you were going to, through some program of education, teach this out of people. Actually, it has the reverse effect of reactance. And there have been a number of psychological experiments that show the more you push this idea that, if you say Trump is a racist, if you say the Confederate flag is racist, you actually get a backlash effect and more people supporting these things in these psychological experiments. And so it's just so I think this is really a lot of what's happening is you're getting rapid demographic change interacting with certain kinds of human psychology.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to ask for patience from our audience because I know I asked for questions, but as I mentioned, I'm on my second reading of this book, and I'll be reading it again after that because there is just so much to get into. We could have a 3-hour interview and we wouldn't even get to it. But I do want to get to similarities and differences between how immigration fueled populism played out in both the UK's Brexit and the 2016 election of Trump.
Yeah, I think these things are much more similar than different. And so, for example, the same characteristics which predict a Brexit voter will predict a Trump voter. So a question like things in Britain were better in the past, a question, even views on death penalty are a much stronger predictor of your support for a Trump or Brexit than anything economic, such as whether you've lost a job or you're rich or poor. And so, yeah, just very powerful similarities. And we see them also, and of course, the issue of immigration being an absolutely key predictor. So I think these things are both very similar. And you can also look at the fact that in both countries, the mainstream parties were arguably not, so in the United States case, for example, there was a lot of difficulty in talking about the immigration issue within the Republican Party. It was seen that the Republican Party wanted to pursue an interventionist foreign policy, for example, neoconservatism, low tax, and religious conservatism, but it was very reticent to really sort of pursue immigration restriction. And that's kind of where Trump, who was the only candidate that made immigration central. Now, it's not that Romney and other candidates didn't talk about it at all, but it was a subsidiary issue. Trump really goes right after this, and he also goes after political correctness. And you see a lot of these sorts of dynamics happening with European populist right parties as well. And they're doing the same thing. And so I think there is that connection really between the two. So I see the two as much more similar than different. Whereas if you were to compare a figure like George W. Bush to a European conservative, there's a massive difference between those two, because the issues George W. Bush was talking about, like religion, had absolutely no resonance in Europe, whereas these issues around immigration and ethnic change are exactly the same issues. And in that sense, I think Trump is a much more European figure than a George W. Bush.
I thought that was interesting in your book when you talked about when we arrived in history at Trump, that the politics of the United States actually became more recognizable and intelligible to Europeans than previously,
Right.
So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Promise I'm going to get to some of these questions. Jake Stein on Facebook is talking about a speech maybe that you gave earlier this year on surveys showing how bad or not as bad current political correctness, woke cancel culture is. Does that ring a bell? Right. And what was the main takeaway?
Yes. Well, essentially what's occurred is you've had an evolution of political correctness of the 80s and 90s. The dial's gone from about an 8 to about an 11 because there are simply more graduates of sort of the radical programs. And also, I think the other thing to bear in mind is these were being talked about in academia. So there's a great study by David Rosado that looks at millions of academic abstracts and also millions of newspaper articles. And you can see that the academics were talking about sexism and racism at very high levels from the 70s and 80s and 90s. But then in the mid-2010s, the newspapers got hold of it where they really weren't paying much attention. And so these ideas from the campus really spread off campus. The ideas I call cultural socialism, including this anti-whiteness, really migrates in a big way into the press, partly because of social media, because social media connects academics and journalists, but also because the newspapers are moving to a more clickbait eyeballs model of revenue generation and less of a classified ads model. And so they're going for more partisan appeals. All of that allows these radical ideas to migrate off campus. But what I would say is these ideas, these hot, the sort of cancel culture, are only working because of a substrate, an existing, what I kind of call a banal wokeness or banal cultural socialism, which was already there from the 60s, which involved hypersensitivity to anything that might offend minority groups. That's already in there in the 60s. Racial sensitivity training is there from the 70s, and affirmative action, disparate impact, all of this lingo and all of these precedents and high sensitivity is already there in the population. And whenever activists tried to go crazy on it in the past, they were never really resisted. So there are episodes of academics being canceled as early as the 1960s and certainly in the 1970s. Never any real pushback because of the power of the taboos, which was already established. It's just that there were fewer foot soldiers and they were less well organized. Social media and everything allows them to organize, and there are more graduates of these radical programs which produce more foot soldiers.
All right, Alex Tremor on Twitter asks for data showing the relationship between the number of immigrants and how many actually integrate into the society they enter, which gets to, the various ways of handling Whiteshift, whether it's sort of the salad bowl or the melting pot.
Well, it's a tricky one to say that, more rapid immigration leads to an ethnic diversification of the population, whereas, like in the US, when you had that immigration pause between the mid-20s and the mid-60s, eventually that led to ethnic neighborhoods breaking up, more intermarriage, particularly across lines like Protestant, Catholic, Jew, which had been relatively unheard of. And that melting process, what that then does is it reduces diversity in the population. And so you get this sense of, if there's less diversity, then there's less of a driver for the kind of right-wing populism we see. So it takes some time, because I think a lot of this is due to multiple generations. So it takes many generations for immigrant groups to eventually start to move out of their areas, but especially to intermarry and especially to change their identity. And what we've seen really in the last, it's certainly in Europe in the last 20 years, but in the US as well, with the rising foreign-born population share, is that you're getting a rise in this diversity, and the assimilation is not proceeding fast enough to sort of affect that. And I think that's the equation, really. Now, whether a country pursues the salad bowl or the melting pot, I actually don't think that makes much difference. What the politicians talk about in France, they say we are the Republic, and in Britain or in Canada, they say multiculturalism. On the ground, I don't think it makes an enormous difference, really. I think that in fact, it's very difficult to find any government-led integration program that really makes a vast difference. Perhaps in Singapore, where the government can tell you where to live, they make sure that every housing block is perfectly representative of the total population. There's absolutely no segregation. Okay, but in a free society where people can choose where to live, you're going to have segregation. And it's only a question of time, multiple generations, that will break down.
So getting back to the situation in the US, given Biden's defeat of Trump and the recent muted midterm gains by populist Republicans in particular, does that mean that the populist moment has faded, or that the issue of immigration, despite the images of utter anarchy at our southern border, has lost its salience?
I think definitely not. What I would say, however, is that when people are worried about a pandemic, or they're worried about the cost of living because of a war in Ukraine and because of supply chain constraints and things like that, when the economy is a bigger issue, then immigration is a smaller issue, actually is the relationship we see. So right now, we're still living through a difficult economic situation. We've had a pandemic. All of those things are things that tend to dampen, not increase populism. Now, as that starts to fade, and it will at some point fade as an issue, we will be back to normal economic times, and inflation will start to go down. Then I would expect concern of the economy will start to decline, and that's what happened prior to Brexit, prior to Trump, is people were less concerned about the economy because after the 708 crash, the economy had started to fade in people's minds as a big issue, and so that gives more room for other issues to come up. So I actually think we are actually at the beginning of a period where we're going to be returning back to what we saw prior to 2016. Now, I'll give you an example from Britain. Immigration, people's concern over immigration, which had risen steadily up until the Brexit vote, then went into substantial decline because the government had to implement Brexit. It had to worry about the economy. Then the pandemic hit. Now we've got cost of living because of the Ukraine-Russia war. But now what's occurred, there's been very high immigration, and just in the last little while, immigration has shot back up the agenda. I would predict this is going to happen in Europe as well, and these questions, no, they absolutely haven't gone away. Not only that, they've been overlayered by the secondary culture wars battle over speech boundaries, over critical race and gender theory, which I think is mapping on top of these battles over immigration and diversity. So I would predict, now it might be Ron DeSantis instead of Trump, for example. I think Trump himself and his personal characteristics, and perhaps some of his obsession with his image and things, and questioning the election and all this sort of stuff, no doubt had an impact on how well the Republicans did. But I think if you see a person like DeSantis in there, he will be pushing these issues just as hard, and I think we'll probably have success with them.
All right. Now, one of the very interesting dynamics that you talked about, I mentioned up at the top, if you are interested actually in less government, less redistribution, but let's look at the flip side of that. If you're progressive and you want more spending and more government intervention and regulation on climate change, let's talk a little bit about the relationship between rapid immigration-driven demographic change and social trust, and how does that play into the progressive dilemma that you describe in your book?
Right. So this is really a debate which Robert Putnam, the Harvard political scientist, raised. He kept seeing in the data, and now it's very well established, is areas that are more diverse, let's say a local neighborhood, the higher the diversity level, the lower people's trust in each other. That is, if you ask people, how much can people be trusted? If you left a wallet on the street, would it be returned? And even people have done experiments where they leave wallets on the street, right? And so in all of these measures, you get a lower trust outcome in a more diverse community. Now, what's less clear is what happens at the national level, because you can have diversity, but it's very concentrated in certain urban areas, and most of the population is unaffected. But so it's not yet clear whether the greater diversity at the national level feeds into loss of trust at the national level. However, we do see relationships between, for example, greater diversity at the national level leading perhaps to the rise of populism, and that rise of populism partly being predicated on low trust in elites, which is partly based on their inability to handle immigration. And so I do think there is a relationship between this increase in diversity, that is the immigration outrunning the ability of the society to assimilate and melt that population. I think that does seem to be related to the rise of populism and the rise of polarization. Now, polarization, for example, it's not just the United States. Canada, for example, is now, I would argue, as polarized as the United States. If you look at, for example, conservative voters in Canada, approval of Justin Trudeau, it is typically in low single digits and has been for a long time. That is in many ways more extreme even than in the United States. Republicans' approval of Biden would be marginally higher than that. Or switching between parties now is becoming extremely rare, switching between the conservatives and, say, the liberals or the NDP, which is the more left socialist party. So I think we're getting, and issues are defined increasingly along cultural lines where it's harder to reach agreements. It's harder to reach an agreement on whether to raise or lower the Canadian flag in response to what is perceived to be some kind of issue with Indigenous genocide. That's largely, I think, an incorrect read of history, but those issues are much harder to compromise on than the tax rate, where people can say, okay, you want it higher, I want it lower. We'll have a fudge in the middle. And so, yeah, I think that there is this relationship between, and it's not strictly speaking the diversity leading to the polarization. What it is the diversity and different attitudes towards the diversity amongst largely the white majority. So the polarization is much more intense within the white population. Say in the US, African Americans are not particularly polarized, whereas white Americans are very polarized. And so it's polarization on racial attitudes, not polarization. It's not about white versus black. It's about attitudes to Black Lives Matter. Are you against it? Are you for it? That's the kind of thing that really polarizes. But it has a second order relationship to issues that are around identity.
So you have talked about how people are less concerned with the economic implications of mass immigration than they are about the rate of cultural change. And such concerns historically have been dismissed or even condemned, xenophobic or racist. So what might such knee-jerk reactions miss? For example, you've looked at research that shows preference or solidarity with one's own ethnic group does not necessarily equate with an antipathy for another group. Is that correct?
Right, yeah, so there tends to be a very knee-jerk reaction, particularly on the progressive side, to discussing these issues. It's a bit like, so instead of talking about people wanting change faster or slower, the way it's collapsed into this dichotomy of you're either an open person or a closed person. If you don't like the rate of change that exists now, you are a closed person. Instead of saying, well, there's a continuum between people who want it faster and slower, and people are on different points on that continuum, and we have to meet somewhere in the middle. It's, if you disagree with me, if you are a closed person, then you are a deplorable, or that sort of approach, which is very polarizing. And if we look at this issue also of attachment to own group, so my own research would show, for example, that something like racial identification is very much an outgrowth of ethnic identification. So if you ask somebody in the US, let's say, how attached are you to being Irish, if they're of Irish background? The stronger their attachment to being Irish, the stronger their attachment to being white, because white is sort of European, which is a bit like an outer skin of an onion to the inner skin, which is Irish. You can do the same thing for a Hispanic American. How attached are you to being Cuban? The more attached you are to being Cuban, the more attached you are to being Hispanic. It's not actually that mysterious, and it works the same way across all groups. So yes, it's a bit like extended family. Some people are into their extended family. That's meaningful. For others, it's not meaningful. Both of those should be fine. And they also, I should say, aren't related to hatred or antipathy to outgroups. So in the US American National Election Study, which is the gold standard political science data set, people are asked to give a thermometer rating 0 to 100. How cold or warm are you towards a whole bunch of groups? And so the warmer you are, if you're a white American, the warmer you are towards white people, actually, the slightly warmer you are towards Black people or Hispanic people. So there doesn't seem to be this relationship that, if you feel really warm to white people, you're really cold to Black and Hispanic people. Well, it doesn't work that way. And actually the psychology literature, where they've been doing experiments on this for a long time, makes this very clear that in-group attachment and out-group hatred are separate dispositions, except where you've got a war going on or direct conflict over resources. And so, for example, if you feel really warmly toward the Republicans, yes, you feel cooler towards the Democrats. That's a zero-sum relationship in the data, but Black-white or Black or white-Hispanic, that's not a zero-sum relationship. And yet, so often we see these two things elided and conflated, and it's very it just sort of makes it impossible to have a sort of rational discussion.
I can imagine, yeah, people calling you racist or xenophobic. It's not a really good icebreaker for a productive conversation. So,
yeah.
So what are the downstream possible consequences when people calling for slower immigration or less rapid ethnic change when those voices are more marginalized and stigmatized?
Well, I think so. The first obvious thing that happens is the rise of populism, because the mainstream parties are caged in by these speech norms. And
Taboos.
so the mainstream Republicans or conservatives in Britain, if they feel they can't really address this, then the only people that will address it are Nigel Farage or Donald Trump, or a figure who is willing to walk across that red line. Now, of course, it's tricky because sometimes you do need to have a red line. There was George Wallace who wanted segregation, and the main parties said no, and they were right to say no, and eventually public opinion came and followed. But I think the progressives think in this case, well, we'll just follow that script and we'll just make immigration a toxic subject, and then lo and behold, everyone will have to sort of come to our side. But that's not really the way it's turning out with this issue, because it's not the same sort of issue as discriminating against people within your own country. This is more about access to membership and at what level. It's a different type of question. And so, I would say that the results of suppressing that debate is more populism, more polarization.
And potentially violence right down the road.
Potentially violence too. I mean, there is this question about, radical white nationalist terrorism. Well, and what we see, interestingly, is there seems to be an inverse relationship, say, between the rise of national populism. When national populism is doing well, there seems to be a lower rate of radical white nationalist terrorism. It's not to say there's a very strong correlation, but that seems to be the relationship. So where you have a democratic outlet for some of this sentiment, you'll get less of it seems like you get less of a violent element. And I think that this is an example perhaps of where it's better to air these issues. Now, ideally, I would not have the populists taking this on, because with the populists, you don't know what you'll get. You might get somebody who's got a lot of problems, like a Trump, or like, even Salvini in Italy. Some of the things that he said about immigrants really are counterproductive and racist. So you've got a loose cannon when you're dealing with populism. You really ideally want to have this within a mainstream party as a perspective. And you want accommodation and bargaining over where the level should be. Now, without that, yeah, you're right, it does introduce, and it also introduces more alienation into the system, more anti-elitism. If the elites are perceived, and all the institutions are perceived as upholding this taboo, which is seen as illegitimate, then that delegitimates a lot of the institutions. And we're seeing a little bit of this also around these questions of speech boundaries and critical race and gender. If that's being propounded in schools and in corporations and in government agencies, then those lose trust. And so some of the findings now about Republican voters have lost a lot of trust in media, in universities and schools, in a way that wasn't true even, say, 5-10 years ago. And so that's also not a good thing. Ideally, you want the citizenry to trust the institutions and the elite institutions of the society.
And you want those institutions to be trustworthy too.
Right, right.
All right, we just have a couple more minutes, and I want to, we've looked back, I want to look forward. You've called for something that you term multivocalism, as opposed to multiculturalism or modern civic nationalism. So what are the differences, and how might multivocalism facilitate a more harmonious white shift, if you will?
Well, yeah, so this really refers to the national identities. This is the territorial, political, cultural unit, the United States, for example, as opposed to, say, white Americans, which is the ethnic majority. But if we think about national identity as, say, American, part of my argument here is people, depending on their ethnic group and their politics, are going to have a different picture of what's important to them. And we see this, for example, people on the left in Britain or America, they're going to value diversity and immigration as more important national symbols, they are going to say that this is what makes, what makes America is the ethnic diversity. That will be something that is going to appeal more to a Democrat, and especially a liberal Democrat. Whereas somebody who's a Republican might value, for example, landscape and history, even to some degree, the traditional ethnic composition of the country. Some of these more slow changing elements are going to be more important for them. And I think that's actually okay. I mean, my view with multivocalism is everybody's oriented towards the nation that they're living in, not a homeland somewhere else. So it's not multiculturalism, but I think it's perhaps only natural that people in different parts of the country from different ethnic backgrounds or political backgrounds are going to be attached to different symbols in the national mix and construct their sense of nationhood differently. So allowing people to have a different route. So there are many ways to be American, many ways to be British or French or whatever. But what's been occurring, I would argue, is an attempt to shut down certain ways of being, particularly those people who identify with being many generations in the country or identify with landscape or particular aspects of history, like the arrival of, the Mayflower or Western settlement. They tried to say that's not a legitimate way to be American. Whereas what I would say is actually it is a legitimate way, as long as you accept that other people have different ways of being American. That should be perfectly tolerable. And so I think that's my plea for tolerance of different ways of being national.
Which fits perfectly into the open objectivism that we practice here and promote at the Atlas Society. So this has been fantastic. Again, appreciate it. I know it is late over there in the UK. Professor Kaufmann, again, folks, the book is Whiteshift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. I know I promote all of the books of the authors that we interview here, but you're not going to regret this one, so I highly recommend. The links are in our various feeds. So I really appreciate it. Thank you, Professor Kaufmann.
Thanks very much. Thanks for your time, Jennifer.
All right. And I want to thank all of you who joined us for this 130th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. Apologies if I didn't get to all of your questions. As you could see, I was really into this topic, and if it's any consolation, I had twice as many questions that I wasn't able to get to. So thanks for joining us. If you enjoy this kind of content, the research and the work that we put into it, please consider making a donation to the Atlas Society, tax deductible. It's that time of year. And please be sure to tune in next week when Dr. Aaron Cariotti will join us to discuss his book, The New Abnormal, The Rise of the Biomedical Security State, on the next episode of the Atlas Society Asks. Thank you.